So yeah, Nintendo Switch 2 is finally coming. New console, new games, all of that makes you ask questions, right? Questions like, why is it expensive? Why does it look the same? Is this a joke? Can it run Crisis 2? The cartridges taste better now, they double down on the polish. Is this just a scam with extra steps? Who would buy this thing? My grandma died. Can we emulate this thing on PC so we don't have to pay for anything and play Switch 2 games for free? Emulation has come a long way since the days of NES and ZNES in the late 90s. What used to be glitchy programs could barely run Super Mario Bros. Now perfectly copy entire hardware systems with perfect accuracy. The pattern is familiar by now. A new console releases and the emulation race begins. The Dreamcast took about a year to get its first emulator, PS2 took several years before PCSX came out in 2002, and the weirdly designed PS3 took nearly a decade to emulate properly. And with Nintendo's next console officially revealed and releasing soon, we're already wondering, how long will it take to emulate? I mean, especially given Nintendo's increasingly aggressive stance against the entire emulation scene. But to understand the future, we need to look at the present. The current Switch is emulated really well through two main programs, Yuzu and Ryujinx. Both appeared surprisingly quickly on the console's life. Yuzu's first version came out in January 2018, less than a year after the Nintendo Switch was launched. That's impressively fast compared to older generations where emulation often took years to even reach basic functionality. The original Switch uses an NVIDIA Tegra X1 chip, a mobile processor that was already well documented from its use in other products like NVIDIA Shield. This gave developers a big head start since they didn't need to figure out everything about the hardware from scratch. And by 2023, most major Nintendo games were running at full speed on mid-range PCs. Games like Mario Odyssey, Animal Crossing, and even Breath of the Wild ran with minimal issues. But online play remained very problematic, though ironically that's somewhat authentic to the actual Nintendo online experience. And just recently, a YouTuber named Geeker1 did some digging and found out that the chip of the Nintendo Switch 2 is a custom NVIDIA Tegra T239, which came out around 2023. It's about 2 years old now, but Nintendo's still using it because the hardware is somehow still decent. Anyway, so this chip's GPU is based on NVIDIA's Ampere architecture with 6 TPCs, 12 streaming multiprocessors, and 1536 CUDA cores. And while on its CPU, it uses an 8-core ARM Cortex A78C with 6 cores for games and 2 reserved for system stuff. And for the memory, it uses 12GB of LPDDR5X RAM with 3GB reserved for the system stuff. This chip is roughly equivalent to a Core i3 12th Gen or a AMD Ryzen 3 5300U with both low power but decent CPU performance, while the GPU is equivalent to a GTX 1050 Ti or a RX 6400, meaning this could run Cyberpunk on low settings, maybe getting 65 FPS max, and Red Dead Redemption 2 on medium settings with about 75 FPS. That assuming it uses FSR or DLSS, of course. But Nintendo really doesn't focus on better graphics compared to the competition. Just enough to look good and enough for you to have fun playing games. Nintendo's handheld history always have put battery life over raw power. The Game Boy famously lasted 30 hours on a AA battery, and the Nintendo Switch continued this approach with modest hardware that prioritizes battery life. The original Nintendo Switch that was released in 2017 uses a 4310 mAh battery, while the new Nintendo Switch 2 has a 5220 mAh battery. Compared to the original Switch, it's about a 21% improvement. But the new Nintendo Switch 2's bigger screen and new chip demanding more power, the playtime is actually shorter, which is around 2 to 6.5 hours compared to the original Switch's 4 to about 9 hours of playtime. But on the Nintendo Switch 2, the charging is much faster though, thanks to the Nintendo Switch 2's 2 USB ports. The technical challenges of emulating Switch 2 go way beyond just raw hardware specs. Nintendo has been watching the emulation scene closely and is almost certainly adding new security measures. The original Switch used encrypted firmware and a secure boot chain, but these were eventually cracked through hardware flaws that Nintendo couldn't patch. And for the Switch 2, they'll likely add security measures, specifically targeting the methods that emulator developers used before. Modern console security has multiple protection layers. Hardware encryption keys physically built into the processor, secure boot processes that check each component before loading, runtime checks that watch for tampering, and game-specific protections built on disk or cartridges. Looking at PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series X as examples of modern console security, because both remained unemulated years after release, despite all the processing power available to potential emulator developers. But this isn't a coincidence though, because console security has become as important as performance in console design. The Switch 2's custom architecture is another big hurdle. Emulating a processor requires detailed knowledge of how it handles instructions, memory, and output-input operations. With a custom NVIDIA solution, developers would be starting from scratch. Graphics emulation would especially be challenging if Nintendo uses custom features to maximize performance, unlike standard NVIDIA GPUs that use well-known systems like Vulkan or DirectX. A custom solution might be proprietary methods that require extensive reverse engineering. But the emulation community has an amazing track record of overcoming technical challenges. But there's a growing recognition that each console generations become significantly harder to emulate. According to discussions in emulation development circles, the consensus seems cautious but determined. One anonymous user contributor reportedly said, "Modern console security is way more complex than previous generations, but the basic principles are the same. Given enough time and resources, any system can be emulated." The history of Yuzu emulator itself is interesting. It began as a branch of Citra, a 3DS emulator, using the similarities of both the consoles, 3DS and the Nintendo Switch. A small team managed to boot basic commercial games within months, though performance was initially just few frames per second. This revolutionary approach might not work with the Switch 2 if its design very different from its predecessor. In that case, developers will need to start from scratch, similar to what happened with PS3 emulation, which took nearly a decade to reach playable states for most games. And based on history and considering how complex modern systems are, we can make some educated guesses about the Nintendo Switch 2 emulation timeline. Initial proof of concept emulation typically appears within 6 to 18 months after a console's release, assuming there's no major breakthroughs or setbacks. This usually means basic firmware booting and possibly simple homebrew apps running. Commercial games booting with significant issues might take 18 to 24 months. This is when you'd see major titles running at 1 to 5 frames per second with graphics glitches and crashes, technically running but far from playable. After about 2 to 4 years, reaching playable states for Nintendo games would be depending on how complex the Switch 2 systems are and how many resources are dedicated to the emulation development. And for context, PS4 emulation is still in its early stages nearly a decade after the console's release. In contrast, Switch emulation reached playable states for many games within 3 years. The difference is largely due to complexity and security measures. And one of the important factors on how Switch 2 can be emulated is how similar it would be to the original Nintendo Switch. If Nintendo keeps significant compatibility with the current generation, emulator developers may be able to adapt existing code rather than starting from scratch, which would significantly speed up the emulation development. And if making the emulator is hard enough, no discussion of Nintendo emulation would be complete without addressing the legal situation, which changed dramatically in early 2020 when Nintendo sued Yuzu's developers. The lawsuit ended with Yuzu emulator completely shutting down and paying Nintendo $2.4 million in damages. Nintendo's legal argument focused on the DMCA, specifically that Yuzu bypassed Nintendo's protection measures. Nintendo has historically been among one of the most aggressive companies in protecting their intellectual property, aside from Disney, of course. From their view, emulation is both a security and financial threat, especially when emulators can run games before their official release date. In the lawsuit, Nintendo claimed that over 1 million copies of Pokémon Scarlet and Violet were illegally downloaded before the game's official release, and this was made possible by users' ability to play the leaked copies. So, for the Switch 2, we could reasonably expect even more aggressive legal action from Nintendo, potentially even going after individual contributors, hosting platforms, and related services that support emulation development. So, is Nintendo Switch 2 emulation possible? From a purely technical standpoint, yes. Given enough time, resources, and community support, virtually any system can be emulated. The more practical questions are how long it might take or whether legal obstacles might prevent widespread development. There's a natural tension between video game preservation and video game piracy in this conversation. For many, The emulation community is the goal of making sure that these games remain playable long after Nintendo stops supporting the hardware, a noble aim given to the company's history of shutting down digital stores. At the same time, the reality of day one piracy enabled by some emulators creates legitimate concerns for developers and publishers. But what's certain is the Switch 2 represents the next chapter of ongoing technical and legal battle between platform holders and those seeking to preserve their games for future generations. Yeah. What side of emulation are you on? To preserve video games or to pirate them? Because, I don't know. But hey, that's just the theory. A game theory. Thanks for watching. No, I'm just kidding. I'm not Math Pat. This is actually just some random video I made. Anyway, so if you like this video, then click the like button down below there. Just click it, please. And yeah, subscribe to my channel, and I'll see you guys very, very soon. Bye.